in the quiet August heat of Memphis, long before the city woke and before any tour buses arrived outside the mansion's white gates. Graceland sat under a stillness that felt almost sacred, almost uneasy, as though the house itself knew it was witnessing the final chapter of the man who had turned it into a palace of dreams. Inside, Elvis Presley moved through the rooms like a flicker of the man he had once been, a legend wrapped in exhaustion, a king whose crown had grown too heavy. He spent most nights awake, wandering from hallway to hallway, with the soft shuffle of a man who no longer knew how to rest. His bedroom lights stayed on at odd hours. His television flickered through old westerns he barely watched, and although the house was filled with people, cousins, guards, staff, and the loyal Memphis Mafia, Elvis felt more alone than he ever did in a packed stadium of screaming fans. He looked older than his 42 years, not because age had truly taken him, but because life had taken from him more than any single human being could carry. His eyes, once bright with mischief and charisma, often looked distant now, as though staring into memories instead of moments. The man who had changed music forever now moved through his own home, a shadow, gentle, polite, soft-spoken, and heartbreakingly fragile. Those closest to him walked lightly around him, careful not to break the delicate balance he carried inside. They remembered the Elvis who had commanded stages, who made audiences faint, who smiled with the confidence of a man who seemed chosen by the universe itself. But the Elvis in Graceland in 1977 was quieter, heavier, and worn thin by years of touring, pressure, heartbreak, and an internal loneliness that even his fame could not cover. Yet despite all of his struggles, there was still an undeniable warmth to him. There were moments when he would suddenly brighten, his humor returning in quick sparks that reminded everyone why they had loved him for years. He talked often about Lisa Maria's daughter, his heart, his anchor. She was the one thing that could still pull him away from his spirals of exhaustion and sadness. When she visited, the whole house changed. Elvis would smile more, talk more, laugh a little, and hold her gently, as if she were the last piece of innocence he still had. He adored her, and everyone saw it. She was the one place where his heart still felt whole. But even love could not fully lift the heaviness he carried. His health was declining faster than anyone wanted to admit. His breathing was uneven, his face swollen, his energy unpredictable. Still, Elvis refused to slow down. He talked constantly about his upcoming tour, insisting he was fine, insisting he could still deliver, insisting that the world still needed him. The stage was the only place where he felt alive, the only place where he could forget the aches, the pressure, the insomnia, the sadness. Even when his voice cracked or his timing slipped, he pushed through with the determination of a man who believed that stopping would mean disappearing. One afternoon, Elvis sat in his office surrounded by stacks of books, astrology, philosophy, spiritual metaphysics. He had always searched for answers in the universe, trying to understand why a boy from Tupelo had been chosen to rise so high, and why the price of fame had been so steep. His cousin Billy walked in quietly and asked if he was all right. Elvis gave a small, tired smile and said he was thinking, too much thinking, he whispered. He looked out the window for a long moment before confessing that he sometimes wished he could walk down Beale Street again as a nobody, just a young man with a guitar and a dream. Life was simple then, he said softly. Everybody talks about what I gained, but nobody talks about what I lost. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the pieces of Elvis that fame had taken, but never returned. His grief for his mother, Gladys, still clung to him like a shadow. Those who knew him said he never healed from her death, that everything afterward, no matter how bright, always carried a quiet sorrow. He spoke about her often in his final weeks, sometimes with tears in his eyes, sometimes with a distant smile, as if he were reaching for a memory that slipped through his fingers. She had been his anchor, his safe place, and without her, Elvis had wandered his whole life, searching for a piece of the peace he lost the day she passed. Even in his happiest moments, the ache remained. There were nights when Elvis sat in the jungle room with the lights dimmed, staring at the artificial waterfall with a look that seemed older than time. Sometimes friends would hear him humming gospel songs under his breath, soft, broken versions of the powerful voice he once carried so effortlessly. One night in particular, he walked into the living room, sat at the piano, and played Where No One Stands, alone, singing with a trembling honesty that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who secretly listened. From the hallway, when he finished, he kept his hands on the keys for a long while, and in barely more than a whisper, he said, "I'm so tired." It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even sadness. It was a truth he had carried for far too long. Despite everything, Elvis never stopped dreaming of a better tomorrow. He talked about eating healthier, exercising more, finding a new musical direction, taking time off, making films again, always tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went. The reality of his fatigue, his health, and his emotional weight made each tomorrow harder to reach. As the days moved closer to mid-August, something unspoken shifted in Graceland. The staff felt it in the air, the tension, the quiet, the sense that something was coming without anyone being able to name it. Elvis himself seemed both present and distant, like a man standing in two worlds at once. He slept at irregular hours, woke in the middle of the night, wandered through the house when everyone else was asleep, and sometimes simply sat alone in silence that felt too heavy for words. The racquetball building became one of his late-night havens. He would go there, put on old records, listen to music from his youth, and sometimes talk to friends about dreams he still wanted to chase. But his body betrayed those dreams more each day. His breath shortened, his energy faded, his spark dimmed, and yet, he kept trying to be strong for his daughter, for his girlfriend Ginger, for his staff, and for the fans. He never wanted to disappoint. In those last days, he spent time playing with Lisa Marie whenever he could. Their moments together were pure, filled with love and laughter, the kind of laughter that seemed to bring him back to life, even if only for a moment. She was the one person who made him forget how unwell he felt. Her presence softened him, brightened him, grounded him. But even that love couldn't erase years of physical strain, emotional battles, and the crushing expectations of being Elvis Presley. As August 15th and 16 approached, the halls of Graceland grew quieter. Elvis moved slower. He spoke less. His thoughts seemed far away, deep inside, places he didn't share with anyone. And yet, he carried a strange calmness with him, as though he were preparing for something only he understood. His body was failing him, but his dignity remained, his gentleness remained, his desire to give remained. Even in his quiet suffering, even in his exhaustion, he remained Elvis Presley, beloved, iconic, deeply human. A man who had given the world everything he had, even when the world asked for more than he could give. A man who carried his pain with grace, his heartbreak with silence, and his love with sincerity. A man living the final moments of his journey inside the one place he loved most. And in those final nights at Graceland, as the lamps cast long shadows and the summer heat wrapped around the mansion, like a heavy blanket, Elvis Presley began unknowingly, writing the last pages of a story the world would never forget. The days leading into the middle of August at Graceland carried a strange mixture of heaviness and tenderness, as though time itself was slowing down around Elvis, wrapping him in moments that felt both fragile and meaningful. The house was busy, as always, staff moving quietly through hallways, phones ringing in the office, tours passing outside the gates. But inside the walls where Elvis lived, there was a stillness that felt almost spiritual. He spent more of his time in the bedroom suite, often resting on the large bed that had become both his retreat and his refuge. He would sit up with books piled beside him, flipping through pages without truly absorbing their meaning, as though searching for something his heart needed, but his mind could not grasp. His nights were restless, his days unpredictable, and everyone around him felt a silent worry. They didn't dare speak aloud. Even his laughter, when it came, felt softer, almost nostalgic, as if echoing from a version of himself that lived only in memory. Yet Elvis was not a man who surrendered easily to despair. Even in his weakest moments, he carried a quiet determination to return to the stage, to give fans the best show he could, even though his body was begging him to slow down. He talked about the tour constantly, rehearsed when he had the energy, hummed melodies under his breath, and told friends and family that he was ready. It was as if the stage was the last thread connecting him to the world, the place where he still felt like he mattered, where he still felt like the king. Performing had always been his lifeline, the one place where the loneliness faded and the applause filled a void. Nothing else ever could. Even when his voice strained, even when his heart felt heavy, the stage gave him purpose, and he clung to that purpose with the last of his strength. But the people closest to him saw the truth slowly tightening around him. They noticed the way he struggled to breathe after climbing the stairs, the way he held onto furniture for balance, the way exhaustion washed over him like a tide that grew higher with each passing day. They watched him fight his own body, smile through pain, crack jokes to hide worry, and pretend everything was fine. They wanted to intervene, to make him rest, to save him from the pressure he put on himself. But no one could tell Elvis Presley what to do, not out of fear, but out of love. He had lived his entire life doing the impossible, pushing beyond limits, proving that the boy from Tupelo could become the biggest star on earth. To tell him he couldn't perform, that he needed to stop, felt like taking away the last piece of himself he still believed in. The Jungle Room became one of the places he retreated to in those final days. A room filled with green shag carpet, dark wood furniture, and the soft murmur of the indoor waterfall. There was something soothing about the space, something comforting, as if the room itself wrapped its arms around him when the world felt too loud. Some nights he sat on the large couch surrounded by friends, talking about old times, laughing over stories from the early days of rock and roll. Remembering the joy of the road before fame became a weight he could barely carry. Other nights, he sat alone, lost in thoughts he didn't share, looking at the waterfall as if it held answers hidden in its flow. Ginger Alden often found him there, deep in reflection, his eyes filled with the haze of hope and sorrow, like a man standing at the edge of two worlds. Ginger stayed by him as much as she could during those weeks. She was young, but she cared deeply, and she sensed more than Elvis ever said aloud. She noticed how often he rubbed his temples, how frequently he paused mid-sentence to catch his breath, how his hands shook slightly when he reached for a glass of water. She understood that this was not the same Elvis the world knew. This was Elvis, the man, vulnerable, wounded, exhausted from a lifetime of trying to be everything for everyone. She listened when he talked, sat with him when he was silent, and held space for him when he seemed lost inside himself. Their relationship was complicated, tender, and often quiet, built more on presence than conversation. Elvis didn't need grand gestures, he needed someone who simply stayed. And Ginger stayed. His final week at Graceland was filled with moments that seemed small at the time, but later felt monumental. On one of those evenings, he gathered with friends in the racquetball building. They laughed, played music, and Elvis sang softly, choosing songs from the past that carried memories he could still hold on to. Afterward, he sat at the piano and performed a gentle, heartfelt version of Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. Those who were there said his voice that night was filled with something deeper than emotion. It was filled with farewell. He didn't announce it, he didn't speak it, but it was there, woven into every note, every breath, every pause between lines. No one knew that would be the last song he ever performed. As the night grew late, the air inside Graceland felt thick with August heat. Elvis returned to the main house, moving slowly, his steps heavy, his mind distant. He talked with Ginger about mundane things, plans for the next day, books he wanted to read, places he hoped to visit someday. He spoke about the tour, insisting he would get back into shape, eat healthier, lose weight, get stronger. He was determined to rebuild himself, even when his body whispered otherwise. It was a kind of courage that broke the hearts of those who loved him, the courage of a man who refused to give up on the world, even as the world was quietly letting go of him. In those same hours, Lisa Marie was asleep in her room just down the hall. Elvis checked on her often during her visits, sometimes standing in the doorway just to look at her, his face softened by a tenderness that was almost holy. She was his light, his reason, his joy, the one thing that made him feel truly alive. He adored her more than anything, and in those final days, he clung to her presence with the pure, quiet love only a father could feel. Whenever she laughed, he lit up inside. Whenever she hugged him, the weight on his shoulders seemed a little lighter. It was moments with her that kept him going. That gave him a sense of tomorrow. That made him believe he still had time. But time was slipping. On the afternoon of August 15th, Elvis spent hours flipping through books on spirituality and life after death. He had always been fascinated by the unseen world, always searching for meaning beyond fame, beyond music, beyond the expectations of millions. Those around him later recalled how peaceful he looked that day, how reflective, how strangely calm. It was as if he felt something coming, but did not fear it. He made phone calls, talked to his dentist about an appointment, told friends he was ready for the tour, kissed Lisa Marie goodnight, and stayed awake long into the night, reading, pacing, thinking. And then came the early morning hours of August 16th, a time when the rest of Graceland slept while Elvis prepared to head to the bathroom to read, something he often did when he couldn't sleep. Ginger saw him walk toward the doorway with a book in hand. He told her not to fall asleep until he returned. She nodded. It was a small moment, one of countless small moments they shared in the quiet, nighttime routine of Graceland. Neither of them knew it would be the last thing he ever said to her. Minutes passed, then more, then too many. Graceland remained silent, unaware that history was shifting inside its walls, unaware that the man it had protected for so many years was now slipping away. Outside, the world slept under the soft Memphis sky, while inside, the king of rock and roll took his final steps into the final moment of his life. Elvis had lived a life larger than any story, carried burdens heavier than any crown, and loved with a heart far more human than the world ever realized. And now, in the early hours of a quiet summer morning, the legend and the man stood at a crossroads only he could see. The last night of Elvis Presley's life at Graceland was not filled with drama or spectacle. It was filled with simple things: books, quiet conversations, gentle checking on his daughter, soft reflections under dim lights. It was filled with the humanity the world never let him fully show. It was filled with the softness of a man who had spent his entire life being strong. It was the beginning of a goodbye the world did not yet know it was saying. And as Graceland settled into the deepest part of the night, the king unknowingly walked into history, leaving behind echoes of songs that would never fade, memories that would never die, and a love that still lived inside the mansion where he took his final breath. The sun rose slowly over Memphis on the morning that would echo across generations, touching Graceland with a soft glow that felt almost unreal, as if time itself held its breath for the man who had once made the world dance, dream, and believe. Inside the house, the air carried a heaviness that words could barely hold, a silence wrapped in memories of laughter, of music echoing through the halls, of footsteps that once moved with the rhythm of destiny. The final chapter of Elvis Presley's life didn't unfold like a glamorous Hollywood script. It unfolded like a quiet, heartbreaking poem written in the shadows of fame, exhaustion, and a level of loneliness only those at the top of the world ever truly understand. As Graceland slowly came alive on that fateful day, staff moved quietly through the house, whispering, checking on things, not yet knowing that history was just minutes away from changing forever. And upstairs, where visitors would never be allowed, where Elvis kept the last fragile pieces of his private world, the king faced the final hours of a life that had given everything to everyone, except maybe to himself. The hours before were gentle, but strange, almost unreal, like a movie fading into its closing scene. Elvis, exhausted beyond what his body could carry, had been restless through the late hours of the night. Somewhere deep inside, he must have felt the weight of years, decades of performing, touring, being tugged by fame, expectations, heartbreaks, pressure, and the constant need to be Elvis Presley, a role for larger than any mortal man could inhabit without cracking. He paced, read, spoke softly, tried to quiet the noise in his mind. He had hopes, still plans for new concerts, dreams of getting back into shape. wishes to reconnect with his audience in a way that felt fresh again. But even hope struggles when the body whispers truths the heart refuses to hear. Elvis's health had been failing for years, and though he fought hard, he fought like a man who believed he could still reclaim the magic. His body was tired, too tired. The household sensed something was off, but no one could name it. There was a tension in the air, a feeling people recalled later, saying they didn't know why, but felt a kind of heaviness that morning. Ginger Alden, Elvis's companion at the time, had been one of the last people to speak with him. Their moments were quiet, intimate in that everyday domestic way that fame couldn't steal. Elvis had talked about books, about his plans, about rest, about finding balance. He told her he was going into the bathroom, his private sanctuary, his thinking space, and that he wouldn't be long. As he disappeared behind the door, there was no sign, no warning, no dramatic farewell, just the simple movements of a man unaware that the final page of his life was already turning. Minutes passed, then hours. Stillness replaced sound. Stillness replaced footsteps. Stillness replaced everything. When the door finally opened and the shocking truth revealed itself, the world inside Graceland cracked like a fragile glass dropped without warning. Ginger froze, horror gripping her. Elvis lay on the floor, unresponsive, still. A man who had once commanded the attention of millions, now frighteningly quiet. Panic erupted. Staff rushed. Cries filled the hallway. None of it felt real, not to those there, not to Memphis, not to the world that would soon hear the news. That didn't make sense. Elvis Presley, the man whose voice had changed music, whose presence had electrified generations, whose smile had lit up screens, whose charisma had turned him into an icon, was gone. Only minutes had passed, but time had split into a before and after that the world would forever remember. The frantic attempt to save him was filled with desperation, tears, disbelief. Phones rang, paramedics rushed, doors slammed, hearts broke. Everyone moved fast, but it was as if fate had already made its decision. Ambulances arrived, carrying with them the last thread of hope. They did everything they could, but some stories end softly, even when the person living them burned brighter than 1,000 stars. As paramedics worked, Graceland's gates filled with faces pressed against the iron bars. Neighbors stepping outside, fans driving in from nearby streets. People sensing something had gone terribly wrong, even before the radio and television stations confirmed it. Inside the ambulance, as it sped toward Baptist Memorial Hospital, the king of rock and roll lay in a silence deeper than music, deeper than applause, deeper than all the years that had crowned him as a legend. Moments later, in the stark stillness of a hospital room, Elvis Presley was pronounced gone. 42 years old, too young, too iconic, too loved to disappear. And yet he had. The news hit the world like thunder. Radio stopped their regular programming. Broadcasters froze on camera, their voices trembling as they delivered the impossible. Homes across America went silent. People cried in their kitchens, in cars, on porches, in living rooms where Elvis's records had played for decades. The streets of Memphis filled with mourners who didn't know where else to go except the gates of the place Elvis had loved the most, Graceland. Flowers piled up, fans clung to each other, reporters gathered. The world had lost many stars before, but losing Elvis felt different. It felt personal. This was a man who had given everything: his youth, his energy, his health, his heart to bring joy to millions. And in the end, the pressure, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the chaos of fame had simply taken too much. Elvis, the man behind the myth, had finally collapsed under the weight of being Elvis Presley. Inside Graceland, heartbreak echoed through every room. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was shattered. No parent ever imagines outliving their child, especially a child who had become the pride of an entire generation. Vernon cried openly, unable to contain the devastation of losing the son he had raised from a humble Mississippi boy into the most famous entertainer on the planet. Priscilla Presley felt the loss not just as an ex-wife, but as someone who had known Elvis intimately for years. His fragility, his compassion, his quirks, his shadows. And Lisa Marie, just a child, had lost her father, her hero, in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. Heartache ricocheted through every crack of the Presley family, and though the world mourned, their grief was deeper, rawer, more agonizing than anyone outside those walls could ever understand. As preparations for Elvis's funeral unfolded, the world watched with the reverence usually reserved for royalty. Crowds lined the streets for miles. People fainted. People prayed. People sang his songs through tears, their voices trembling as they whispered, "Love me tender," into the hot Memphis air. The funeral procession moved like a river of sorrow, sweeping through the city that had grown up with Elvis, that had sheltered him when fame became unbearable, that had embraced him as its own son. The sight of the white casket carried carefully, surrounded by men who had been part of Elvis's life, the Memphis Mafia, his childhood friends, bodyguards. Confidence was almost too painful to witness. They weren't just losing a star. They were losing the man who had laughed with them, cried with them, trusted them, lived with them. Graceland became a shrine overnight. People stood outside its gates for hours, leaving flowers, teddy bears, letters, artwork, candles, photographs, anything they could offer to a man who had given them so much. The mansion, once filled with Elvis's booming laughter, the sound of his piano keys at AM, and the smell of late-night sandwiches he loved to make, now felt like a museum of memories frozen in time. Lisa Marie's toys still sat in corners. Elvis's jumpsuit still hung in closets. His favorite records were stacked neatly beside the stereo. Life had stopped, but the house still breathed his presence, as if Graceland itself refused to accept that its king had left. In the days that followed, conspiracy theories bloomed like wildflowers. Rumors that Elvis had faked his death, that he was hiding somewhere, that he had escaped the crushing weight of fame. People swore they saw him in airports, in diners, in faraway towns. But deep down, these theories weren't born from truth. They were born from heartbreak. The world wasn't ready to accept that someone as iconic, as monumental, as beloved as Elvis could simply die. Legends aren't supposed to end. Legends are supposed to last forever. And in a way, Elvis did. Just not in the way people had hoped. The years passed, but Graceland never lost its glow. Millions visited every year. Old fans who had seen Elvis in his prime, young fans who discovered him through their parents' records, families who wanted to teach their children about the man who changed music history. People walked quietly through the halls, respecting the space like a sacred site. And upstairs, the rooms where Elvis lived his private life remained locked forever, preserved out of respect, sealed like a time capsule holding the secrets of a man who had carried the world while battling storms no one truly understood. Commemorations, tributes, concerts, movies, documentaries all kept the flame alive. Elvis's music continued to break records. His influence reached new generations. His voice remained unparalleled, untouched by time, forever echoing in the hearts of millions. But of all the stories that followed his death, one truth always stood above the rest. Elvis Presley wasn't destroyed by fame, drugs, or excess. He was destroyed by the weight of giving too much, too fast, too young. His heart had been too big, his generosity too wide, his passion too fierce. He loved his fans with the sincerity few stars have ever matched. He took care of people, friends, family, strangers. He gave away cars just to make someone smile. He donated to charities quietly, without cameras. He believed his purpose was to make people happy even when he himself was hurting. And because he gave so much, there was little left to hold himself together when the pressures of fame, age, health, and heartbreak collided. Today, when people visit Graceland, they don't just see a mansion. They feel a presence. They feel music in the walls, warmth in the rooms, history in the air. They feel the story of a young boy from Tupelo who grew up poor, who carried dreams bigger than Mississippi skies, who rose to heights no one had ever imagined, and who despite it all remained human, fragile, tender, and vulnerable. Elvis wasn't just the king of rock and roll. He was a man who lived intensely, loved deeply, and fell painfully. And in his final days at Graceland, beneath the lights, behind the closed doors, he faced the last quiet moments of a life that had been anything but quiet. And so, the world remembers him not for how he died, but for how he lived, for the voice that shook nations, for the performances that lit souls on fire, for the kindness that touched hearts, for the beauty of a man who gave everything he had, until he had nothing left to give. Elvis Presley left the world too soon, but he left it changed. His story, the triumphs, the battles, the tenderness, the tragedy remains one of the most powerful reminders that legends are not made of perfection. They are made of humanity. And Elvis, even in his final days in Graceland, was as human as any man could be: heartbroken, hopeful, struggling, loving, hurting, dreaming. A king, yes, but also a man. And that, perhaps, is why he will never be forgotten.